The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hi, this is Rob Benedict.
And I am Richard Spate. We were both on a little show you might know called Supernatural.
It had a pretty good run, 15 seasons, 327 episodes.
And though we have seen, of course, every episode many times, we figured, hey, now that we're wrapped, let's watch it all again.
And we can't do that alone, so we're inviting the cast and crew that made the show along for the ride. We've got writers, producers, composers, directors, and we'll of course have some actors on as well, including some certain guys that played some certain pretty iconic brothers.
It was kind of a little bit of a left field choice in the best way possible.
The note from Kripke was, he's great, we love him, but we're looking for like a really intelligent Duchovny type.
With 15 seasons to explore, it's going to be the road trip of several lifetimes. So please join us and subscribe to Supernatural then and now.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this episode is part of our ongoing Mary, Queen of Scots series. Last week, we reached the end of Mary's life, but her story lives on, obviously. And this is an interview I recorded before I recorded any of the Mary episodes, because it's an interview with Clare Hunter, and she is the author of a book called Embroidering Her Truth, Mary, Queen of Scots, and the Language of Power. And if that title sounds familiar to you, it's because I've shouted it out in every single one of these episodes because it was one of my main sources for researching this entire season. This book I read it when I was just starting to do my research, which is why the interview was a while ago. And it really helped shape this whole season of the podcast because of what Clare Hunter has done in this book is to what no other biographer of Mary Queen of Scots has done before, which is to look at her life through the textiles she purchased, displayed, gifted, and created. So what Clare says is, in an age when textiles proclaimed power, Mary exploited them to advance her personal and political agenda, affirm her royal lineage, and tell her own story. Clare also wrote here, I felt that Mary was there, pulling at my sleeve, willing me to appreciate the artistry, wanting me to understand the dazzle of the material world that shaped her. And so this is a biography of Mary Queen of Scots, and it literally goes from her whole life, just looking at through this lens of fabric and the sewing that she did, that other people did. As we talked about in like every episode, because this biography was so influential on my research, is that Mary, during periods of time where she couldn't safely write a journal, she couldn't keep a diary, but she was able to sew and to stitch, and we really can see both in what she chose to create and also in just the the way that her stitches were they even or were they uneven? Just what was her state of mind? Like Mary Queen of Scots embroideries, I think you know from the previous episodes of this series, they're so important to me. I find them so fascinating. And it's really, even more so than seeing letters or something, just evidence that this was a real person who lived. Anyway, I'm so excited to share this interview with you finally with Clare Hunter. Again, her book, Embroidering Her Truth, Mary Queen of Scots and the Language of Power. It's available in the UK and it's going to be available in North America later this month. And it's such a good book. And I really enjoyed talking with Clare about Mary Queen of Scots and the textiles of it all. So enjoy. Okay, so I'm joined today from an idyllic part of Scotland. It's Clare Hunter. Welcome, Clare.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm really excited. When I first read about your book, I thought, oh, I'm excited to read this book. And then when I read it, I thought, oh, I really hope I can get a chance to talk to Clare and have her on the podcast, because I think it'll be so interesting to the listeners.
And have you always been a Mary Queen of Scots fan?
I'm a big Mary Queen of Scots fan. Yeah. Actually, here, I'm going to show you something. This is a little Mary Queen of Scots doll.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah, it's. I keep her here while I've been researching her. She's sort of my mascot. Can you tell me about your connection as a Scottish person, or just as yourself, to Mary Queen of Scots? Do you remember when you first felt an interest in her or a connection to her?
Well, of course, being Scottish, then she was a Scottish queen. But I think really when I was very small, and we used to play, us little girls used to play in the playground, and we used to pick dandelions. And the game then was that one of you would try and blow off all the petals of the dandelion. And as you did that, the rest of the little girl gang would chant, Mary Queen of Scots got her head chopped off, Mary Queen of Scots got her head chopped off. So we knew the name very early on. And of course, in the times I was growing up, then there used to be in toy shops the most wonderful historical dolls, which I could never afford, and my parents could never afford to buy me. But Mary Queen of Scots was amongst those, dressed in her black velvet with the white veil. And so I used to yearn and look longingly through the shop window at the doll of Mary Queen of Scots. And when I was writing the book, then through eBay, I got my Mary Queen of Scots doll.
Oh, good.
I had her as my mascot on my desk as I wrote. And also, I think, we were brought up really being taught the history of men in Scotland. And apart from Flora MacDonald and Mary Queen of Scots, we didn't hear about other women in past times. And so she's always been a feature of our kind of knowledge of Scottish history as a woman. So I've always had an interest. And over time, you would have the Four Marys song, last Nick I saw about Four Marys, although actually it's not written about Mary Queen of Scots and her four female companions, the Four Marys. We always believed in Scotland it was. And that was always sung, at Cayley's and things like that. So she's always been there in the background, so to speak. I wanted to bring her more into my foreground through the prism of textiles. Obviously, there are hundreds of books written about Mary Queen of Scots, but they're mostly dealing with her personal and political life through a historical idea. And I wanted to use her textiles as the focus to see what that might reveal of her that maybe hadn't been revealed before.
I really appreciated your book because I've been researching her recently, and I get something different from every book, but yours was presenting, I'm hoping you can explain how you did some of the research, but you were looking at sort of lists of what textiles were bought and when, and then in your book you relate them to, and this is what was happening in her life at that time. And that shows in a very tangible way, the way that other books sort of imagine what she was thinking. Your book can say, well, here's what she was planning, here's the textiles she was ordering, so here's what we know she was thinking, probably. It's a whole different way of seeing it.
And before I actually wrote the book, that was my hope. When I was researching it, then I had discovered all the fantastic treasurer's accounts during her reign. Now, this is like her kind of Amazon purchase list.
Yeah.
So it lists in detail all the thread, all the fabrics, the clothes, the fees to tailors. It says how much she was buying. It says where that was coming from. Was it, a Paris black? Was it a Venetian satin? Often it says the color, and also it says how much it cost. So that was very interesting. So I had all those. And the other thing that was there were all her inventories. So both the inventories of her father, James V of Scotland, and her mother, Mary de Guise, which of course Mary inherited when she came back to Scotland. The inventory of what Mary herself bought in France when she went to marry the Dauphin. And before she came back to Scotland, she obviously went on a massive spending spree and bought, some fantastic gowns and some extraordinary bed hangings. Interestingly, only one set of church dressings, furnishings, presumably because she was very aware that Scotland was, the Reformation had happened and that Scotland was looking on decoration with askance. So she was very circumspect in what she brought back in ecclesiastical terms. And then there were the inventories of what was in the Royal Wardrobe store when she was queen. Many of the, not many, but quite a lot of the items then annotated by her valet de chambre, Servais de Comte. And he would say what Mary did with those textiles, either with her own clothes or with the clothes of Mary de Guise, her mother, or indeed what she did with the textiles that they had in store, because in those days, fabric itself was kind of hoarded as treasure. Henry VIII, the King of England, basically when he died, then there were over, 55,000 yards of textiles in his royal wardrobe, so we're talking a large amounts that were kept. Now, she would basically distribute these either to ladies of the Scottish court whose friendship she was wanting to win. She gave them to her own four Marys, the friends that I've talked about, who had been with her since her child. And she gave them to them because she had actually worn them, then they had more potency, as in a sense, a gift of self. She gave them to some noblemen when she was trying to again win their favour. And indeed, she took out of the royal wardrobe some of the clothes of her mother and had them adapted for her own use, including about 5 cloaks, which of course were symbolic of protection. So all those inventories, and latterly, then we have the last inventory of what she left behind when she fled to England, what she left behind in Scotland. So those inventories reveal a lot. And some of them, those annotations that her valet de chambre made, were dated. So what I then was looking at was correlating what was happening in Mary's life with what she was either purchasing or what she was using, what she was taking out of the store, and for what purpose. And what did that tell us about either her political intent or indeed her emotions at the time?
And can you talk a bit about the fact that she wore black so much of the time when she was in Scotland? I thought that was very interesting.
Yes, well, black in the mid-16th century, we're talking about black, was the colour of statesmanship. So Mary wore black in order to emphasise her role as a political queen, as well as a personal queen to Scotland. It was also the colour of constancy. So again, it had an emotional symbolism behind it, which meant that she would be loyal. And I think it's very interesting to look at how, we've got very few portraits of Mary, but the portraits we have wearing her black, as you say, compared to the portraits that Elizabeth I of England at the same time was making of herself, Elizabeth is festooned in, ribbons and lace and pearls and huge ruffs and huge sleeves and farthingales, etc. And she was trying to show herself as an expansive queen, whereas Mary is trying to portray herself as a trustworthy queen who has got political acumen and is going to lead the country in an effective way. And that's why black was an important colour to her. Behind the scenes, of course, at court revelries or at masks, etc., then there is another wardrobe, an alternative wardrobe, which is in her inventories, which isn't black. So there must have been times when she changed out of her, when she could take on a more social role amongst her own intimate court, when she then donned gowns of all sorts of colours and striped with silver, braided with gold, a whole other wardrobe of finery. But we have no portraits to allow us to know what that looked like.
I found it really interesting too, just the way that you were researching and writing this book. You really get a sense of that she was a very aesthetic person. She really loved fine things. She loved beautiful things. And you talk about how many dresses she had was, I don't want to say disproportionate, but she couldn't possibly have had a chance to wear all of them when she had such a large wardrobe.
Yes, but compared to the wardrobe of Elizabeth I, I mean, when Elizabeth I died, she had 2,000 gowns in her inventory. Mary, when she did the final inventory, it was basically under 20 gowns that she possessed at that time. Of course, she'd been in captivity for all those years before that. And often, I don't know because we have no record of it, but a number of Elizabeth's gowns would be given to her as gifts. Ambassadors from courtiers, from other European rulers looking to court her favour. And it may well be that Mary herself, we have no listing of the gifts given to Mary, but it could be that some of the gowns that she possessed were indeed gifts as barter.
Well, actually, but just speaking of that, there was one point at which Mary herself sent a gift to Elizabeth that included her own stitching, right?
She did. And again, this is a time when elite women are taking up embroidery, really to be as another form of writing, really, a form of a different kind of agency. Before that, embroidery had mainly been in the hands of convents and monasteries. And also the equipment and materials for embroidery was rougher and readier. But in the 16th century, we see a major change. We see the Reformation coming. So we see embroidery moving into secular hands more. And we also see through Spain, finer needles being imported to the rest of Europe. And so suddenly finer embroidery can be done. And I like to think of the ladies of the court sitting, looking very docile, with their heads bowed over their embroidery, but actually listening to every single word that is being said around them and having their own private conversations about what that means politically. So when Mary was in captivity then, as you say, and she then made Elizabeth a number of gifts. She made her little embroidered nightcaps, but the most extraordinary gifts she sent her to, there was a time when Mary had a small window of opportunity she'd lost Elizabeth's favour because of the plots made against Elizabeth, in which Mary was implicated, although not guilty at that point. And basically, she then decided that she had this small window of opportunity, and these great letters to the French ambassador asking to be brought back the finest silk fabric, the finest that can be got, to get silver thread. Because she has some work to do, but it must be done in haste. And then we get another letter saying, "Oh, the silver thread you sent is far too thick. Could you send me a thinner version of it, finer version of it?" And what she actually made for Elizabeth was a skirt front, which was of entwined thistles and roses. It also had honeysuckles and pinks, which have also got are also symbolic. But as you know, the rose, the Tudor rose, was a symbol of English sovereignty, and the thistle, the symbol for Scotland. Red is the colour of blood bonds. And the fact that Mary embroidered it with her own hand, Elizabeth being a needlewoman herself, because we've got evidence of her embroidering it as a girl, would have understood exactly how much time Mary had spent in its making. And it was reported back to Mary that the English found it very nice. But which maybe wasn't as high enough praise for me at the time. But he also reported that he thought that the English Queen had much softened towards Mary. So the gift had served its political duty. It had done what she hoped it might do, but it didn't win her liberty.
And just going back to what you said a moment ago about how stitching became sort of a way for these royal women to express themselves in a way, we don't have their journals, but we can see based on what they chose to stitch, or, how even the stitches are, maybe what was going through their mind. Can you talk a bit about, you mentioned this in your book, Catherine de Medici, and the stitching that we know that she did, and Mary would have seen her doing that?
Yes, it's interesting that Catherine de Medici, because we imagine her as this kind of formidable woman who engaged in black magic, etc. But there is a wonderful, again, report of Catherine de Medici every afternoon sitting with what was called lattice work, which is a kind of open white network in which you can embroider images. And if you imagine it, she learned it in the convents in Italy, where she was put there for safety when her life was threatened as the downfall of the Medici was underway. And then at 14, she was sent to France to marry Henri. But of course, he had his mistress there, the intelligent, cultured Diane de Poitiers, who was running the show. And so it must have been really demoralizing for Catherine to find a way to manage this ménage à trois between the three of them. And I imagine her every afternoon just thinking, this is my time. I'm just going to sit quietly and embroider, forget what has happened in my past, forget what is the kind of challenges I have around me at the moment. And I'm just going to have an hour or two, which is my time. And when she died, they discovered over 1,000 pieces of that lacquer's work. So it just shows you how important it was to her as a kind of therapeutic, in my view, aid to keeping calm in what were very difficult circumstances. She was 10 years without children, until she actually became pregnant, which for a queen was very dangerous. Because they could be done away with, basically, if they didn't produce the wanted heir to the throne. So she had a very, very difficult time.
And we know that Mary, Queen of Scots, had various health issues. Obviously, there was a lot of mental anguish, stress from what was going on around her. So I thought it was really interesting to bring it back to the embroidery that she did. And you mentioned that she would be stitching while she was taking meetings with her advisors. She was just kind of constantly embroidering.
Yes, and we don't know much about her embroidery in Scotland, and we don't have any evidence of that embroidery. But once she moved into captivity in England, then it became both a salve and a crusade, in a sense, because she had her letters censored, some confiscated, but her embroidery was unedited. She could, through her embroidery, put down what she wanted, and nobody could interfere. The other thing about sewing is as many people listening will know, is that sewing is sociable. And Mary had lived a very lonely time of it at the Scottish court. She had no family of her own, apart from half brothers and sisters who she hadn't been brought up with. She had no close friends apart from her four Marys, who ultimately, apart from one, did marry and moved into their own families. She had nobody she could trust. She had no great advisor, as again Elizabeth did to William Cecil. And so she was very, very isolated. So she moves to captivity, and one would have thought that was isolating, but actually in her household she had Bess of Hardwicke, who was a very redoubtable, spirited, energetic, creative, keen embroiderer, keen needlewoman. She had her own household with her valets de chambre, what were called her chamber children, and her ladies in waiting, etc. And you can imagine that scene of a wet afternoon of them all sitting around with their sewing, helping one another, saying, could you finish that off for me? Have you got any more of that brown thread? Having a laugh as they devised the embroideries that she and Bess did together. There's a lot of mischief in there. And I've spent many years doing community textile projects. And I know if you get a group of women together to design something, then eventually it becomes a bit ribald in its humour, and stories are told and shared. It would have been the same in Mary's day. It would have been exactly the same. There would have been a lot of laughter. So finally, in that, although a captive, she had camaraderie. And that must have been a great solace to her, never mind the rhythmic solace that embroidery itself brings.
Can you describe the large project that it seems she and Bess of Hardwicke were working on together?
Yes, they worked in a set of bed hangings together. And again, this was very novel at the time, what they decided to do, because they decided to make it through using little parts of embroidery, little patches of embroidery. Well, they're not that small, actually, but they're about 12 inches by 14 inches, different shapes, cruciforms, rectangles, etc. Some are larger than others. But basically, to do these smaller pieces of embroidery, which then would be appliqued to a large piece of cloth and act as probably bed hangings. And luckily for us, because Bess was such a great curator of textiles, and when she died, insisted in her will that the textiles remain within the family, we still have a number of both her and Mary's embroideries, and they can be seen at Oxburgh Hall in Norfolk. And there's some in the V&A Museum in London, and there's 2 of Mary's and 1 of Bess's in the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh. So it's fantastic to have those actual embroideries that they did together. And their idea was that when they were assembled, now we don't know what the scheme was, but the 2 women would have a scheme so that as you read through and along and up and down, the embroideries would have been placed in a relationship to each other to basically amplify the meaning one to the other. So sometimes that would have been done, as I say, with mischief in mind. So you saw one image and then looked to the other. And if you could get the connection, then you would understand that there was something clever that they had done with putting those 2 images together. Sadly, we don't know what that arrangement was. And they used a lot of books coming out at the time of kind of like encyclopedias of flora and fauna, etc. And they used a lot of those as source material, but often they, particularly Mary, would adapt them or add another motto to something to give them another meaning.
Can you talk about her stitchery or her piece that's the cat, the ginger cat with the mouse? And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Ah, the web tour. Those that both creators and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's up, Timmy? This is how you deal with weird!
No! Do not harm my children!
Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket is in trouble, Akasa! Can we turn on the wind show remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.
And we're back.
The Ginger Cat. Well, the Ginger Cat has to be my favourite piece, and so there's an embroidery which originally would have been her source material would have been a book by Conrad Gesner of the time, and it's his black and white woodcut that she has copied for that embroidery. But of course, she has cut, because she's embroidering it, she has coloured it in thread, and she chose to make it a tabby cat, i.e., a red-brown cat, and basically to personify it as Queen Elizabeth I. And she's changed the kind of the expression of the cat a little bit from Conrad Gesner's original. And so this cat's rather smug, and its whiskers are a little bit more aggressive. But the most interesting thing is that she's Mary herself inserted into that picture a little mouse. And in Mary's picture of that cat, its tail is basically it's out towards the mouse, but the cat's paw is pressing very firmly on the mouse's tail. And really, therefore, it was an expression of Mary's own feelings about her captivity. And interestingly, the mouse is very lumpen, it's very squalid, and it's really as if Mary drew that herself. And again, if that's the case, then it basically captures Mary's own sense of lack of self-worth, her own emotional and political immobility at that time. So there's a tragedy in that picture, although it seems to be of a jolly cat. But really, it's about being trapped. And I think that with Mary's embroidery, she's added again, that wasn't in Gesner's original, she's added in a kind of trellis carpet that's in blue and gold, quite, pattern carpet. And I think, well, why did Mary spend all those hours doing that? And the needle in those days was symbolic of kind of an arrow piercing its target. And so I like to think that Mary chose to embroider on and on with this particular piece, to pierce through it and somehow to try and get through to Elizabeth, however vicariously, and pull her close.
I love the way that you just described that. And it's similar in the book, because upon when I first saw a picture of that cat piece, I just thought, oh, that's funny. That's odd looking. And I thought, is this true? Is that really something Mary Queen of Scots did? Because it's so striking looking and so interesting. And then of course it is. And then you visited, is it at Hardwicke Hall? Is that where you saw it?
At the Palace of Holyrood House.
Oh, at Holyrood House, yeah.
In Edinburgh, yes. And I went to see it there, and it was just fantastic to see it close up. They took it out of the case for me, which was wonderful, the curators. Mm-hmm. And what was really interesting to me, it was the nearest I'd actually come to being in Mary's presence. To see her, I couldn't touch it, but I could be inches away from it. And her embroidery was very unsettled. I mean, Mary actually wasn't a fantastic embroiderer. She was more interested in the content rather than the technique. Beth was a very good embroiderer, and you can tell that from her stitching. So Mary's embroidery is uneven. You can see how it kind of flows along for a while, and then it stumbles, and there's a bit of an erratic stitching going on until it starts to flow again. So her tenacity in terms of embroidery, I mean, in that one embroidery, I counted there would be over 10,000 stitches. Now, Mary did both large numbers of these small pieces for these hangings that she invested together. She also did some cushions. And when she went for her execution and there was an inventory made of her possessions, there were over 300 pieces of embroidery that were mostly unfinished. But there's also other embroideries that we do not have, but have been described. So the amount of work, the amount of sewing that she did is extraordinary. And that's why I call it a crusade. It was through her sewing that she was basically capturing her own testimony for posterity, and particularly for her son, James I of England and VI of Scotland, who, of course, she'd had to leave behind in Scotland when he was 10 months old, and who she never saw again. And he'd been brought up by the reformist nobles to believe his mother was an adulteress, was a murderer. And so she had to get her story, her real story, through to him, and she used embroidery to do that. But we don't have the actual embroidery, but we do have a written description of it.
That's so fascinating, because there's so much has been written, including recently, about her letters and the way that she wrote them in code and things like that. but just knowing that her embroidery was also a way for her to communicate.
Yes, and was also coded through its imagery and its relationship of an image to a mortal, then it is a form of visual code as well. I was going to say that only those who knew what she was referring to would be able to really understand what she was saying in that piece.
Of the embroideries that exist, if people want to be able to see them in person, so the cat that's at Holyrood House, and then Hardwick Hall, you write in your book as well.
Hardwick Hall has 2 cushions by Mary. One is usually on display, and it's also got a large number of embroideries by Bess of Hardwick. And Hardwick Hall itself is the most fabulous place to visit for anybody who's interested in textiles, but just because it's a glorious place to see. Bess built it as a kind of, to basically counter the accusation that she was an ambitious woman, which was seen as something terrible in the 16th century. And so she then built this extraordinary, most beautiful place in England at the time. And because she was such a creative person, then it's an extraordinary building, and filled with tapestries and textiles because she adored them so much. And then Oxburgh Hall in Norfolk, which again is completely charming in itself, has got a large number of both Mary and Bess's embroideries. They've been assembled onto green velvet at some point in past centuries. We're not sure when. And so you can see a large number of 30 of them, I think, just over 30 of them are verified as Mary's because they carry her monogram or her cipher or have a thistle or something that's a reference to Scotland. And others, we're uncertain whether it was her or Bess who made them. But if you look very close at stitching, then you can hazard a guess.
Just based on the technique, as you were describing. Yeah.
Use the same technique, but it's Bess is the finer needlewoman.
Actually, just while we're speaking about Bess of Hardwick, can you describe, I thought this was so fascinating, the project that she had commissioned that was textile portrayals of famous women from history?
Yes, well, these are at Hardwick Hall, and it is just amazing to see them because they are as rich. Obviously, the colours will have faded a bit, but she used the recycled vestments that had been confiscated during the English Reformation for them. They were obviously the work of professional embroiderers, but Bess probably, and Mary, when she came into Bess's husband's care, would possibly have stitched on them as well. And they are life-size images of women through time, through mythology, through history, as a kind of celebration of women's courage, intelligence, vitality, and importance. And they are absolutely extraordinary and beautifully displayed at Hardwick Hall. So another treat for anybody who goes there.
And just pivoting back from Mary and Bess and their stitching itself back to the textiles that she would have acquired, something else I was just hoping you could describe was how you write about her execution and her ensemble and what the significance of that. Can you describe what you found out?
Well, of course, you have that image of Mary walking to what was her execution. She wears her iconic black robe, the gown, and a trailing white veil, which, of course, white was the colour of innocence as well as the colour of spirituality. And then she's taken onto what was a black velvet-clad platform. The executioners are dressed in black, and around her are the great and the good of men of both the court and the locality in black. There's a fire blazing in the fireplace, and then it comes to the point when Mary has to kneel down in order to have, sadly, her head chopped off. And her ladies, two of her ladies in waiting, prepare her, and they take off her outer gown to reveal her undergown, which isn't a petticoat, it's just an undergown, which was of fiery red, which was the liturgical colour in the Catholic faith of martyrdom. And then they remove her black sleeves to again reveal undersleeves of red. And so there is this glow of Mary in amongst all this black, walking to her death in a moment of sartorial triumph as a martyr, because this is the colour of martyrdom. And Mary, to the very end, was using her textiles as statements, as declarations of who she was.
I had heard before about that she had the reveal of the red at her execution, but just the way that you described it and the meaning of it, and in the context of your whole book, where you're saying she was silenced in so many ways,
Yes.
but through her textile work, like she's screaming, like you can
Absolutely
really see.
to be silent. And of course, it's being heard by us now, which is wonderful. It did reach an audience, at the time, not maybe. Although I like to think that wearing the red, yes, the colour of martyrdom, but also Elizabeth I's mother, Anne Boleyn, when she was executed, she had also worn red. And so I like to think that Mary had a double intent there, that she was also echoing Anne Boleyn's execution as a reminder to Elizabeth I that actually women are brought down by the greed of men when often they are innocent.
I find it so, you were saying, she was giving up these messages and now today we can understand them. And through your book, you're kind of, with your experience and your knowledge of textiles and stitching, you're kind of the translator. You're saying, here's what she was doing. And then through you can explain, and here's what that means. And so I really appreciate that.
Yes, and it'd be interesting, Anne, to know, if you took other people, Catherine de Medici, again, her inventories are fascinating. There are other people, if you did that same approach for women, what would be revealed about them that we've never been told by what has largely been male documenters of the time, of contemporary to those women, or male historians later on, who had no interest in textiles and the interior world that these women were surrounded by. Because women at court lived mainly interior worlds. They did hunt, they did go out, etc. But they weren't, the world of their power was mainly interior. And so their interiors were the important background to their presence.
How did you first get the idea to look at these inventories?
My first book, Threads of Life, was about the social, emotional, and political significance of sewing. And one of the chapters was really about power. And I chose Mary Queen of Scots as my kind of central figure for that chapter. And for my initial research, discovered the inventories. Because she was just part of one chapter, there was absolutely no way I could then really go into what those inventories could tell us. And that's why I thought, actually, there might be another book that is just about Mary. And then I could really use these inventories. And not just the inventories of her, but of her father, of her mother. I looked at Catherine de Medici's inventories as well. I looked at inventories made when Mary was a child at the court of France, which lists all the extraordinary child attire she was wearing, Venetian satins and shot silks and cloth of silver and gold when she was 11 years of age. So all of them are really, really fascinating for what they tell us of the kind of importance. Mary in France was a political prize, so she was dressed as such. When she comes back to Scotland, and I love the fact for her first parliament, she and her four maids spent quite a large amount of money on dressing her four maids in their ceremonial clothes of purple velvet. And they were young. They were all 17, 18-year-olds. So to have them processing down the high street in Edinburgh with their long trains fanning out behind them, sparkling their jewels, was an extraordinary declaration of female power at that time.
Everyone who's listened to this episode, I would imagine, is going to run away and go read your book right away, because everything that you've just described there's so much more of exactly this sort of discussion in your book. And so I really encourage everybody to look at it. I believe it's been out in Scotland, in the UK for a while now. It's only just coming out in North America. Have you had any feedback from readers?
Yes, very, very nice feedback. Luckily for me, because you're always, when you're writing a book that's based on historical fact, then you're terrified that you're going to get lots of emails saying, well, actually, no, it was a Tuesday, not a Wednesday that, Mary Queen of Scots met Darnley, her husband, that kind of thing. So luckily, a couple of small things, but nothing major. And yes, for both when I go and do book events, or I get, which is always lovely when you get emails from people just telling you I just had to write because actually I really found your book fascinating and I really enjoyed it. And I learned so much more about Mary. And obviously what I was hoping to do with this book was to reveal Mary in a much broader way than she's usually shown through her textiles and give people a different kind of insight into her, both as a woman and a queen. And from the feedback I get, it seems that the book has achieved that, which makes me very happy.
Of the many things I appreciated about your book was it also really presents her as a person, because so many of the writings about her are saying she comes across as sort of just a victim of circumstance. And you're saying like, well, here's what John Knox was doing and here's what her brother was doing. And she was just kind of flailing around. But your book really puts her at the center. Who is she and what was she doing and what were her actions? And I really appreciated that.
And Mary was a very intelligent, very highly educated woman. And although in many people's eyes, she made some very poor decisions, she took her own political risks. She did weigh up. People would have her marrying both Darnley, her second husband, and then Bothwell from passion. I actually don't think Mary was a passionate person in that sense. I think she cared for her position as the Queen of Scotland, as a basically appointed by God. She was a very devout person, and she saw this as something that she had to safeguard, not for her own aggrandizement, but because it was what she was put into the world to do. And her marriages were all expedient in her eyes at that particular time, at that specific time. And we haven't got, people would have to read the book to go into the detail behind those. But there is a lot of evidence there that Mary was choosing carefully how she approached her life and her reign, and then it all got out of control as she then became it became too difficult, too challenging for her to do. And as I say, she had no one advising her, nobody she could trust around her. Whereas Elizabeth I always had William Cecil at her back as her protector. Mary did not have a protector. She was having to make her own way.
And I would say, and at the point that this episode is coming out, people will have heard 6 hours of me talking about Mary, Queen of Scots. But I think she did the best she could given the circumstances. Better than a lot of other people in the same role, I would think.
Given the circumstances, and if you think of the circumstances, of being, her father dead when she was just days old, sent away from her mother at the age of 5 to the French court, even her 4 Marys taken away from her at that point so she could absorb the culture of the French court and the language without them around her, losing her first husband on Francois II, in terrible circumstances, with her at his bedside as he died, the real love of her life at that point, and her a widow, not wanted in France, didn't know where else to go in Europe, and came back to Scotland that was not very enthusiastic about her return. And then married Darnley, her second husband, who of course then was murdered. She was implicated in the crime, and then forced to marry Bothwell for different reasons, which again I won't go into. And then basically very shortly after they married, being defeated and imprisoned. And she was 24. And miscarried, had born a son, had miscarried, had her life threatened on numerous occasions, and basically then at 24 is imprisoned with nothing around her. With two gentlewomen at the very start of that, and then eventually she fled into captivity in England. So in that way, a tragic life, and then the odd glimmer we get of her when she's when everything is the few moments where everything seems to be going well, then we have a charismatic queen, somebody who's energetic, who's, as I say, is very intelligent, and who's spirited and courageous, but who's brought down by the ambitions of those around her.
Yeah, it was just I don't want to say perfect, but just a storm of just so many people, things that had been happening long before she was alive, the political climate. It was just too much for her.
Yes,
it was too much for anyone.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about all of this stuff.
Thank you for inviting me, as I say.
When I was planning these episodes, I asked my listeners, what are you excited to learn about Mary, Queen of Scots? And somebody said, I want to learn more about her embroidery. And I said, oh, there's going to be a whole episode just about that. Just wait. Yeah. But thank you so much again.
Not at all. So I'll have to listen to the others actually as well. Please. Take care, Anne.
So Clare's book is called Embroidering Her Truth, Mary, Queen of Scots and the Language of Power. It's available now in the UK. It's going to be available in North America later this month on August 22nd, apparently. And I want to let you know also about what Clare is up to and if you want to know more about what she does. So she has another book that is called Threads of Life. And there is a chapter in that about Mary, Queen of Scots, but it's also talking about just other women in history and their life through sewing. So Threads of Life, it explores the power of sewing and why so many of its stories have been forgotten. It's so interesting. That one's available all over the place. It's already out. And she also has a website that's called Sewing Matters. And so this website is a place where you can read about, explore, and discover the social, emotional, and political significance of needlework. So she writes that while she was writing her books, she came across many fascinating, forgotten, little-known, and overlooked stories of sewing. It is these that she wants to share, and she also invites us to tell our own. So Clare has been involved for the last 30 years. She's been involved with textiles as a community artist, exhibition curator, and banner maker. In 1986, she set up Needleworks in Glasgow, working with people of all ages and cultures, using sewing as a way to celebrate local history, document community experiences, and share personal concerns through the creation of wall hangings and banners. I love her work. I love talking with her. I encourage you to read her book, Embroidering Her Truth, and also Threads of Life. Links to both of those will be in the show notes. And also just go to her website, which is sewingmatters.co.uk. I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. And next week, we're going to be getting to the final episode of the Mary saga, which is not to say the final episode of this season, but we're going to be looking at Mary's legacy. And also we're going to be talking about her score, the Scandalicious score. It's going to be a whole discussion. I have some special guests are going to be coming with their thoughts about how she's going to score in all the various categories. There's also going to be some special awards and things. Anyway, just kind of wrapping up Mary's saga as a whole is going to be next week. So I am looking forward to sharing that with you all. And also note after that, there are going to be more episodes in this season because there's a couple more people from Mary, Queen of Scots' life who are worth their own episodes. So stay tuned for that as well. Anyway, so this is Vulgar History. My name is Anne Foster, and you can keep up with me on various social medias. I do want to clarify, I don't mean like join all the social medias and follow me on them. I just mean like if you happen to be on one of these things, look for me there. So I'm on TikTok at Vulgar History. I'm on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod. I'm now, ironically, given the topic of this episode and the title of this book, I'm on Threads at Vulgar History Pod. And I also have a Patreon, which is patreon.com/AnneFosterWriter. And when you join there by giving a small monthly donation, you get early ad-free access to all episodes of this podcast, as well as depending on what level you donate at, you also get access to our special bonus episodes, including Vulgar Piece Theater, where I talk about costume dramas in episodes. The episodes of Vulgar Piece Theater generally are longer than the movies themselves that we talk about. I think that's all the reminders. Oh, merch, obviously, merch store. So speaking of Mary, Queen of Scots and her stitching and her cat stitching, there is a newish design in the merch store, which is inspired by Mary, Queen of Scots' cat embroidery, which is a much less depressing image because it was drawn by Jan Jupiter, my frequent collaborator from the Netherlands. So it says a cat, but instead of the orange cat representing Elizabeth, it is a tortoiseshell cat representing my cat Hepburn, who is next to me as I say this. And instead of a lump of a mouse representing Mary, Queen of Scots being depressed, it's a happy little mouse who's just chilling. So anyway, it's gorgeous. I ordered myself. You can get this design on t-shirts and stickers and mugs and all kinds of things, but you can also get it on a pillow cover. And I ordered one for myself and it just arrived and I love it. It's maybe my favorite thing I've ever owned. So I have my own treason cushion and it brings me great joy. Anyway, so there's two different merch stores. And I did that because if you're in the US, TeePublic seems to work really well for you, and you can get to that one just by going to vulgarhistory.com/store. If you live not in the US, and the shipping is better through a service called Redbubble, and you can get the merch, all the same designs, at vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. Again, all those links are in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me on this journée, this ongoing saga of Mary Queen of Scots. And yeah, next week we're going to be looking at her score and all that sort of thing. And so until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Anne Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth.
Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. Look for The Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.